I'm Chance.
I'm Sarah Catherine.
And welcome to Season 2 of Conservation Connection.
Presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
We're a husband and wife team running a wildlife education nonprofit. It's focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week, here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day across the globe.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their careers,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
This episode is a collaboration with Sitka WhaleFest and the Sitka Sound Science Center.
Sitka WhaleFest is a celebration of whales and marine science that happens every November in Sitka, Alaska. It aims to communicate marine science to the ocean-loving public.
Listen in to hear the stories of leading researchers and educators in the Pacific Ocean ecosystem as they share the science and the passion that brought them to Sitka.
Our trip to Sitka was funded in part by Midnight Science Club.
Let's get to the show. Alrighty guys, welcome to another episode of Conservation Connection. We're here in Sitka, Alaska at Sitka WhaleFest 2019. We're very excited because we're sitting across the table from Rob Suryan. He is a research ecologist with the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and he's the science coordinator for Gulf Watch Alaska.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you here. Why don't we start with you just telling us a little bit about what your job involves?
So my job as a science coordinator for Gulf Watch Alaska means that I get to work with a lot of really interesting scientists that study everything from the motion of water and the little particles in the water, like plant plankton and animal plankton, on up to humpback whales and everything in between. And part of my job is to try to put all that story together and come up with a cohesive description of what our program is finding out and inform management and other resource users.
So basically, your job is to know what's happening in the Gulf of Alaska and be able to communicate that out to people who are using the resources of the Gulf.
Exactly.
That seems kind of overwhelming that you have, you literally, it sounds like study everything.
Yes, it is overwhelming. I feel like in this situation, I'm that characteristic jack of all trades, master of none. And this is actually a new position for me. Before that, I've done lots of different types of marine studies, but they are much more focused. So I'm at a point in my career where this is quite exciting to be able to put all these different sources together. And I should say that our original funding for this program is from the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council. So a large part of what we do is help inform the Trustee Council. It's now been 30 years since the oil spill, and help them understand why some of the populations that have not recovered since that oil spill may be still struggling and what to expect.
So this is a really broad and almost impossible to answer question, but can you give us just a little snapshot of what has been happening in the Gulf of Alaska for the last 30 years? What is the main story and changes that we've seen?
So in the past 30 years, the biggest change that we've seen in the Gulf of Alaska is that we've seen an increase in these large predatory fish, which has been good for fisheries for those particular fish. So for example, Pacific halibut, Pacific cod, and walleye pollock are three species that are very commonly fished in major markets in the U.S. But the change that we did see was that as those increased, some of the more commonly used prey items, the forage fish, those smaller animals, smaller fish that lots of other species and different animals eat, a lot of those have declined in number.
Not surprising necessarily that with the rise of more predators comes the loss of a lot of those prey animals, but it's interesting to hear that the population for those predators has risen and remained kind of steady when there's a lot less food to be around.
Let me go at it from a little bit different direction too, is that in the ocean, we talk about bottom up and top down processes. And so when you think of the predator increase, they're going to have a top down or consumer influence on the prey. But there's also all these bottom up ocean productivity, plant plankton, phytoplankton growth, animal plankton, zooplankton abundance. Those kind of effects also determine how many fish are in the ocean too. And there's often kind of an interplay of the two. And so I talk about some of these predator populations increasing, but they're not stable. They're not steady. They fluctuate.
If there's been this big shift in what the more dominant group is in terms of abundance, is there any kind of prevailing theories as to what may have caused the shift?
So yes, there's a couple ideas related to that. And some of that has to do with just climate changes in the North Pacific, changes in both current patterns, that ocean current patterns, and then also temperatures in the ocean, and what we refer to as these different forcing mechanisms. And you see some patterns in how those physical ocean and atmospheric changes occur, and some correlations or similar responses by different populations, including salmon and the species that I mentioned of the commercially fished species, but then also, this is during the past 30 years, an increase in other predators such as whales and seals and sea lions. So, and a lot of the increases in those animals were because of previous exploitation by people.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
Prior to the banning of commercial whaling and stuff like that, you had populations really drop to below historical levels. And so a lot of the increase, quote unquote, increase in those larger predator species is really just them returning to or closer to historical levels after being so heavily exploited by humans previously,
Exactly.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
So we are here at WhaleFest, and for those who are listening that didn't have the opportunity to be here, could you give us a view into how you got involved with WhaleFest and what your talk today was about?
Oh, sure. So my involvement with WhaleFest was an invitation by one of the collaborators on our project. So one of the principal investigators in Gulf Watch Alaska is Dr. Jan Straley, who's here with the University of Alaska Southeast and one of the co-organizers for the Sitka WhaleFest. So the invitation came from her, and mostly because of over the past couple years of us, her focus on humpback whales, my focus on trying to integrate their humpback whale data with the other data from our programs, like the prey data, the forage fish, the temperature data, and the zooplankton data, to try to determine why these whale populations, and especially in recent years, had declined dramatically. And part of my presentation was related to that. So putting into perspective this marine heat wave that recently occurred in the Gulf of Alaska and all of the Northeast Pacific, the U.S., west coast of the U.S. and Canada, how that has impacted all these different populations. Many it was negative, some it was positive. But part of that question is, how do we understand how these animals are impacted and what the mechanisms are?
And it's interesting because your mechanisms is always going to be kind of the golden standard of like what actually caused this. Otherwise, it's correlation, right? We know that this happened, and at the same time, this also happened.
Yes.
Did A cause B? Did B cause A? Did C cause both A and B together? And so looking for mechanisms of causation is a really hard thing, but a very important thing if you're going to use that information for management, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And so this, as you alluded to, there's so much to try to combine, so many data streams, and it's a necessity. It's a process you have to go through. But in reality, that's really what we're evaluating, or what is the preponderance of evidence showing? What is the correlation between these different occurrences? And to get at mechanisms requires really experimentation. And it's hard to experiment with an ecosystem or with the Gulf of Alaska, right? And you often hear references to natural experiments. So, for example, this heat wave really is a natural experiment to push the water temperatures to this level of increase for such a long period of time. That is an experiment. But as a scientist, if you're conducting an experiment, you need your control group and your experimental group, and you need multiple of those groupings. So we have a sample size of one.
Right.
So we do have some limitations on what we can actually understand. But what we do are, in addition to these long-term studies and assess what these multi-year, environmental occurrences, how they're affecting populations, we also do focal studies of specific processes that we need to understand too. And that's through a lot of collaborations that we have. We are a long-term monitoring program, but we have a lot of collaborators that we can work more on those process studies.
Yeah, I can only imagine that you said it, there needs to be tons of data streams in order to really be able to understand what's going on and have a full picture of it. So I bet your list of collaborators is about 2 miles long of people who are contributing.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So, as we said before, you have your kind of fingers in a lot of pies, I guess is the phrase. what does a day, or maybe the better question is like, what does a week in the life of your job look like? Because it's hard to comprehend, like, how are you, I know you're out there researching and you're also analyzing, and there's a lot that goes into this, and it seems a little overwhelming.
Right, yeah. So I'm going to answer that as a little bit going through my career to some extent. So you mentioned out collecting data. Early in my career, that's absolutely what I would be doing, spending sometimes 2.5, 3, or 4 months away from the office, away from home, out in the field collecting data, whether it's out in a field site or on a ship. But as you progress through your career, you do less of that, and you provide opportunities for the new, younger generations, the new biologists, to do that kind of work. And so I'm more at the late career where I don't go outside very much. I don't go out in the field very often, but I work with all these people who do. And part of that's exciting to me because I used to do that, and it gives me a chance to enable others to do this too. I do get to go out on research cruises, usually a couple a year, and that lasts for a couple weeks at a time. So I'm not away too long. And now with a family at home, I don't want to be away that long. So really the average day and week for me is I'm behind a computer. Yep. And sometimes I feel like a professional emailer, and I try to avoid that because, you do, with all these collaborations, there's so much coordination, but I just do my best to find time to also allow for analysis and allow for writing. And as you get more senior in your career, you also do a lot of reviewing. So reviewing papers that are written by people within your group, but also as a scientist professionally, there's a lot of requests from you, from many people outside your organization. And it's just kind of your professional courtesy to provide external reviews, participate in student committees, review proposals that other. So for example, we submit a manuscript, a scientific paper, at least 3 other people have to review that paper and agree upon it before it gets published. So
for every one paper published, that's 3 or 4 other groups of people that have read it and validated it.
That's right. Yes. And that's part of peer review process for science publication. But then that means you need to review others to return that favor too.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's a mechanic and professional practice of science that doesn't see the light of day very often. It's just, scientists publish this research.
Right.
And the public doesn't really understand how much behind the scenes work goes into working on other people's papers, reviewing what they have written and being a part of their student committees. And there's so much of that professional give and take that happens. And, you've clearly experienced that as a late career scientist, the longer you're in the field, the more you are expected to do more and more of that, right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. And really, it's the same thing that you do in elementary school, right? You review essays from your
exactly.
classmates. That's exactly what we're doing. Just,
just with bigger words.
Bigger words.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And then I think, another big part of it too is making our data useful to as many, and our results useful to as many people as possible. So the publication process that we just described, that can take months, years to happen. Even after you're done collecting data and when you first start writing, it can be a year or more before it's published. And there's resource managers that need that information sooner. And that's one thing that we're really working hard to do, is to provide our results and our data as soon as possible before fully published, with the caveat that, our findings are preliminary until they're peer reviewed.
Right. That's a really hard teeter-totter to balance.
It is.
Because on one hand, the people need the information now so they can make management decisions. But you want to be really sure that your information is valid scientifically, that it's sound and actually represents what's happening, so that
Exactly.
you're not providing misinformation on accident. You're having to balance speed and quality.
Absolutely. Yep.
And the collaboration aspect that you mentioned, I think, is so important, because I feel like in so many different fields and areas, you don't have that willingness so much to collaborate. And, as you're saying, you get tons of emails of people requesting information, and some people would just kind of be like, oh, I'm too busy, I don't have time. But it is a really interesting thing, especially Chance and I have had the opportunity to work with so many scientists and people in this field, and everyone's just so willing to share information, which I think is really, really great.
I agree. And I think to some extent that's a bit of a culture change in science too. And I think it's partly because of just the younger generations and more openness to that type of collaboration, but also the need to answer the questions that we have as scientists. We need to collaborate. And also because our fields have gotten so technical. Well, you can do some pretty complex studies on your own too, but you can do so much more and answer so many other questions. And sometimes you need all the expertise because there is so much technology involved.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you said earlier, a jack of all trades, master of none. You have to know who the masters are of this very specific trade so that you can say, hey, I need help with this specific analysis or this specific type of organism or whatever. And that collaboration enables much deeper analysis of problems and of data sets than if any one person were to take it on by themselves.
Right. And that's a part of the job that I really enjoy, to build that team and work with those people who are the experts in that particular part and then try bringing that together. So some of the data I work with, rather than going out to collect the data, I do a lot of computer programming to integrate large data sets. And the field has changed dramatically from when I first started, even my undergraduate and first field courses. I was in wildlife biology, and we didn't deploy instruments like the oceanographers do, or like the engineers do. We were doing observational studies and taking some measurements and writing the data down in our notebooks.
Right.
And we still do that, but we collect so much more data now. I use deploy instruments on animals. So you're collecting data at a same frequency, several bits of data per second, or sometimes the frequency is 100 samples per second.
For an extended period of time and across multiple animals.
Right.
So you end up with this Excel spreadsheet that is like tens of thousands of cells long, and now you have to crunch all that data, and you're thinking,
Exactly.
Man, I really wish I was back in the era of notebooks and like 2 measurements on a trip.
Exactly. Yeah. Before I started working with NOAA a few years ago with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, I was a professor at Oregon State University. And that was part of our discussions for training, is that, now the wildlife biology and fisheries biology students, we need to train them with similar tools that engineers are using in terms of computer programming and big data management. I've gone from doing the smaller scale studies in the field to integrating these large data sets over a longer time period to answer bigger questions with all these experts helping me out, which is really exciting. It's fun.
I bet it was really, really neat to see how the field has shifted in that way because, it's a lot more challenging to manage such a large data set, but the amount of computational power you get, the amount of statistical power you get from that many observations is so much stronger than what you would have been able to collect manually.
Right. That's key. Absolutely. And because of the advancement in acoustics and digital recording, that's now a hugely important source for us for studies. And then also a camera. I mean, a camera was something that you used to take out in the field, just kind of document your methods, may take a picture of your coworkers, but the cameras are data collection devices for us now. I mean, imaging is huge.
Right.
So with a digital revolution, we collect terabytes of imagery data. And now the challenge is processing all that data,
Right.
Developing computer algorithms to go through and select from that data specifically what you want.
Right. Filter out the noise.
Yep.
Keep the information.
Right. Exactly.
Yep.
So with the theme of WhaleFest being mysteries, of course, what is a big mystery you're trying to solve in your organization currently with the oceans?
Most of what we're focused on right now. So I work in the Gulf of Alaska. But in Alaska, we have 5 large marine ecosystems, or LMEs, we refer to them as. So there's the Gulf of Alaska, there's the Aleutian Islands, the Bering Sea, and the Arctic, which includes the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. And this heat wave that we've described, it affected all Alaska. And so my focus is the Gulf of Alaska, But my coworkers are working on similar questions in the Bering Sea. The heat wave has affected the Bering Sea very differently. But I would say our biggest mystery for the Gulf of Alaska is during this heat wave, with the increased water temperatures throughout the water column along the continental shelf for multiple years, the response of the lower trophic level, the plankton, was not as dramatic as we would have expected. You see an increase in warm water associated zooplankton, which are usually the smaller organisms and not as energy rich or not as good a food for predators. So an increase of the warm water associated zooplankton and a just kind of neutral or slightly increase or maybe slightly decrease of the cold water associated species, which are the very lipid rich, and those are the ones we see higher productivity. So, but then we've seen this major crash, this decline in key forage fish species like capelin, and a major decline in seabird reproductive success, major seabird die-offs, missing whales and skinny whales. And so the question is, we talk about bottom up. If it was bottom up, there should be fewer zooplankton altogether, right?
Right.
Just from the lower trophic levels, but there isn't. And so there's got to be, we think, some type of top-down component of the predators having an impact. And the fact that there's fewer predators for some of these major predators, that they're not consuming the zooplankton.
Right.
But that's our big mystery, I think, at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Ecology is always this, it's kind of like this Rube Goldberg machine of like something shifted and now we really don't know what's going to happen at the end or why what is happening. And you kind of have to examine each individual aspect of the machine to see how it has shifted and responded and how that shift affects the next thing, which affects the next thing. You kind of always have to trace it backwards and see what happened.
Right. Yeah. And you have an event like this and oftentimes many other events too. So many levers are moved from an experimental ecologist. Like, well, that's
too many variables. Too many variables.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've loved this year at WhaleFest how related all of the speakers, all of your talks have been so related. And like we interviewed Yumi earlier, so hopefully our listeners can listen to the series and kind of see, like, even though you aren't all studying in the exact same place or the exact same thing, you see a lot of overlap here, which is really amazing.
And you're all looking at response to basically the same phenomenon of the blob and how, what did it do and why did it do what it did?
And I think part of that too speaks to how significant of an event it was.
Right. To have this many scientists who have spent years, 4 years, 5 years at this point, trying to understand what's happening. That is a massive event.
Right. And it's not just us here in Alaska. It's along the California current system too. So Oregon, Washington, California, British Columbia, they're all addressing the same question too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about your sort of trajectory in science and how it's shifted from being out on cruises for 4 months at a time to being more of a reviewer and late stage scientist. In all of your years of sciencing, do you have like a favorite story or a favorite memory or eureka moment or anything that just kind of really stands out as like a highlight of your career?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question. I wouldn't say I have any one particular eureka moment, but there's been, from the science side and kind of the discovery side, I guess I should say, a lot of my previous studies were involved in foraging ecology of, in this case, marine birds, so seabirds. And I think some of the economics of foraging that we learned during those studies, where we're tracking individuals, seeing what kind of food they're consuming, seeing how long it takes them to get that food and bring it back to the nest and feed the chick. Some of those findings have been so broadly applicable to so many other situations I've encountered. And I think that's what is something that's really fulfilling to me. Like, here's this occurrence when we go to lots of different places and lots of different species, it kind of comes down to the same result.
Same basic issue, same basic optimal foraging theory. Like, you want to get the most amount of food for the least amount of work. And that's true of seabirds, it's true of whales, it's true of bears, it's true of people, it's true of everything.
It is. Yeah. And I think what this all boils down to is one of my former advisors, his statement was that energy is the currency of life. And it really is. right? How
That's
much
absolutely true.
energy comes to the earth. And it's one of the laws of thermodynamics, right? Conservation of energy, right?
Right.
And conservation of motion. And and that definitely applies to ecology too. But you also hear a lot of discussions, and there's some mismatch too, in terms of we look at these species of prey that are lipid rich, like capelin and the myctophids that Yumi talked about, the lanternfish, sandlands, for example. And then these other fish species that aren't so lipid rich, like the cod, for example, juvenile cod. And so a lot of the captive feeding studies, you can show that, well, if you feed, these marine mammals or seabirds or fish, you feed them the low lipid prey, and they grow slower, or they don't have their body composition changes too in terms of amount of protein and lipids. And you feed them these higher quality fatty foods, and they grow better. Okay, that makes sense. But the question also is, in the lab, you can also feed those individuals, feed them a bunch more of the low quality food, and they can still do quite well too. But their composition ultimately is different in terms of the amount of lipids in their body and proteins. But one thing that we kind of add to that story is that it really makes a difference what it takes to acquire that food and the schooling characteristics of the prey.
How hard it is to catch it.
How available is it and how hard it is to catch it? Absolutely. And that's something that's not often discussed in that mix.
Yeah.
And luckily with seabirds, they're so visible for those types of studies, and it's easy to track them and monitor. And that's one of the reasons why not only do I enjoy birds so much, but early in my career, I switched to seabirds because you can collect so much information on them to answer those kind of questions.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. This has been a really fantastic episode. I'm very excited to get this up and have all of our listeners enjoy it. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We'd love to hear from you. So if you want to reach out, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
We love questions from our listeners, so if you heard something that you want to know more about, be sure to let us know.
If you've got a minute to spare, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts will help other conservation-minded people find the show. We'd really appreciate it.
A big thanks to the people working to protect our planet, and a big thanks to you for listening. Don't forget to tune in next week.